Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. Hey everybody, and welcome to this week's Art of Procurement podcast. And for the rest of August, I'm actually taking a road trip across the United States. And so, because I'm out of the recording studio, I mentioned this last week, I'm actually dipping into the archive all the way back to 2016 to share some of my favorite episodes from that year. These were episodes that I want to share with you. They're just as relevant today as they were back in 2016 when we first recorded. So if you found the podcast after 2016, there's a really good chance that you haven't heard these yet. And today's rewind, I want to go to a conversation that I had with Jack Miles. There's few, if any, leaders in the procurement profession with the depth and breadth of experience as Jack. Jack has enjoyed multiple CPO roles at some of North America's largest companies and has served as Secretary of the Florida Department of Managed Services. He serves and has served on a number of corporate boards and has actually become a key advisor and a friend to me personally and to Art of Procurement. And in today's show, Jack shares 7 of the lessons that he learned from his career in both the private and public sectors. If you have any interest in growing your procurement career or becoming more impactful in your current role, then whatever level you're at, I think this episode is a must listen. Now, to get things started, I asked Jack the question that I was asking 4 years ago, and I still ask so many of my guests today, and that's, did you find procurement, or did procurement find you?
It's a great question, and I chuckle a little bit because I've often said to people, younger folks going into the work environment, despite what everybody will try to push you into or tell you should be thinking about, probably 90% of the people in the world wind up falling into the job that they wind up being in for a long period of time. And that was clearly the case with me. Mm-hmm. I was in a management development program at Prentice Hall. And the management development program was basically, procedural kind of stuff. We did time studies on, mail insertion and all kinds of other things. Yeah. And it was a great place to start. It was a great learning experience. But I also wound up doing some work for the fellow that was vice president of procurement, Gene Hurley. And I was probably 8 or 9 months into the role, and Gene called me up one day and said, "How'd you like to come to procurement?" And my impression of procurement, having done some work with him, is that if I could slightly differentiate myself from the rest of the people in the profession, it would probably be an interesting career. Right. And it's proved to be exactly that. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of older folks that have been around for a long time, a lot of old things that you were forced to do because that's the way it was. Yeah. And the opportunity to change that was a great opportunity.
And how did the profession evolve then as you started working in it to where we are today, or has it evolved that much?
Well, it's been decades for me, probably going on 4 decades, and quite frankly, I don't think much has changed. Right. I don't think that the mindset of some of the people in procurement has changed. There's still a lot of, people don't invite us in, and we don't have a seat at the table, right. And the list goes on and on of things that people say, and frankly, most of that's because there's an empty chair at the table and they haven't taken it, and they don't have the courage to advance some of the ideas and concepts that need to be advanced in order to do well in the field.
Why is that, do you think? Is it because it's just easier to maintain the status quo and rather than put your neck on the line?
Well, I think, we have a whole series of different personalities that are out there, but I think there's a lot more followers than there are leaders. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that, people just follow for the sake of following, but those that are going to step out and really differentiate themselves from the rest of the folks out there. And if you're just going to follow and you want somebody to tell you what to do, well, that's great. We need a lot of those people.
Yep.
But on the other hand, we also need people that are going to step out and challenge the status quo and try to do things much better and continue the continuous improvement.
Right. So if there's one thing that you look at from a profession perspective, if you had a magic wand, what would you fix about what we do or how we operate or how we maybe work with our business?
Well, it's courage, right?
Yeah.
It's and I've said that a lot, and people say, "Well, define that." And it's a matter of stepping out and be willing to take a risk. I think when I've joined organizations, the magic has always been to make sure that either through the interview process, I meet all of the leadership in the organization, or at least most of them. And if I don't, then my first task when I come to the organization is basically to go out and meet with them.
Yep.
And the obvious question is, why do you do that? Well, you do that because they need to understand and sort of buy into what it is we're trying to do. Quite frankly, buy into me.
Yeah.
Buy into the strategy that we're trying to execute on, even though it's in its very early days, but you generally know. And to get them to a point where they're comfortable picking up the phone and calling me, and when it hits the fan, which it's going to, we just don't know when.
Yeah.
Those leaders will say, "Wait a minute, I met with Jack. That doesn't sound like the way they operate." And they'll pick up the phone and we'll have the conversation and we'll deal with it.
Yeah. So they know the direction that you're coming from, not that you're trying to push something on them that is completely foreign to what they expect from you.
Exactly.
So given the experience that you have both, I think, inside and outside of procurement, we talk a lot right now about the fact that we're at a crossroads of the profession, that we're on this cusp of being something wonderful, maybe that we haven't been before. Is that all talk, or is it different this time? Are there circumstances that are making it different this time?
Yeah, it really depends on the people that you're talking to around it, and I would say it's probably more buzz and talk than it is reality. Does it need to happen? Absolutely. But do I see good, solid evidence that it's moving in that direction? If you're at something like a Coupa event or things like that, you're kind of attracting people that are somewhat change agents and want to do things. But I still find a lot of people that want to, but are still stuck in the envelope and are unwilling to break away.
The concept sounds better than the actual what you need to do to make it happen.
Exactly.
So my difficulty today in picking a topic was kind of where to start. There's so much great work that you've published that I wasn't really sure which direction to go in to start with. And then I came across a great post that you wrote about some of the philosophies, I think the 7 philosophies that you've really learned and applied throughout your career. And so I'd just love if you could share and elaborate on what those are so that the listeners can gain the benefit of your insights from your career.
Sure. I mean, some of it is you've really got to engage with people, right? And you've got to engage. I've always said that, or often said that credit is something you always give that you never take.
Right.
And people always scratch their heads around that because they're saying, well, we have to demonstrate our value. And, I'm a measure and manage guy, so this is going to sound really strange. But nothing could be better than a business leader saying to me, you know what, Jack and his folks, the team really does a great job. And I won't do a deal or a transaction without working with them. And that's just sort of the concept, but the reality is that's what we do.
Yeah.
We look to keep people out of trouble. Many times we've been involved in seeing deals that have been good ones, deals that have had trouble, and deals that we've had to do workouts with. And the reality is, it's what you want to do is prevent those. And there are certain things that we know we need to execute on and deal with that, frankly, they may not find to be important or necessary. Or they think it's going to take too much time, and how do we action some of that? And
so you would rather spread the word of the good work that you're doing through referrals then, rather than shouting from the rooftops telling everyone how well you're doing.
Exactly. And I mean, you can't. Yes, there's a handful of people in an organization that need to know some detail around what you're doing. But at the end of the day, give the credit, because the reality is you're doing this for others.
Right.
It's their budget, it's their money, it's their environment, it's their deal. You're helping them facilitate. And I think giving them the credit for it just winds up being a big plus.
Yeah, you're essentially a service to helping them achieve what they need to achieve, rather than them helping you achieve what you want to achieve.
And you sometimes sit there and snicker, and I can tell you I've snickered many times when you hear people talking about all the great and wonderful stuff that that they did and what they accomplished and how they did it, and you realize that there were some battles over that stuff happening, and you had to do battle over getting it to happen. But the fact that they've embraced it, we were talking yesterday with some colleagues about changing nomenclature and How do you start to understand that an organization has really changed? And I've often believed that if you change the nomenclature on what you call something, and then you start to get that nomenclature back from others where they've institutionalized it and started to talk about it, you've truly made a difference in how people think.
Yeah, changing minds. I think usually when we come into organizations and start trying to do things differently, people have already got a negative connotation with what we do because they've been in the past.
Absolutely.
So I think that's one of the keys, isn't it, to driving, to make people think differently and to realize that, well, maybe this time it is different.
Absolutely.
So the second thing you talked about was doing the right thing. I just wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure. I mean, doing the right thing isn't always easy. And again, you've got to take a look at your role and your function. And in addition to that, the fiduciary role and function that you have to do the right thing for the organization. Yep. And, you know, sometimes you've got to bob and weave within that. I mean, I had an example years ago where we were called into a deal last minute, had a lot of work to do, needed a bit more time to get something done because we felt it was a bit of a governance issue or something that would be important later on, at least potentially. Wasn't given the time, but the charge to the team was figure out how far you can get within the time we've got and leave it at that. The deal got signed. Months later, the business leader came to me and he said, Jack, we have a problem. That stuff that you told me about, we're actually having a challenge with it now, and I have no idea what to do. And I said, read the agreement. We got about 80% of it baked in. He said, but I didn't give you the time. I said, we figured it out. So, you know, we have a fiduciary responsibility of the organization to do the right thing, irrespective sometimes of what people want to give us the ability or the time to do.
How do we determine what the right thing is?
You know, some of it just comes, I mean, it's the silver hair. I mean, sometimes you just know over years what's going to happen. And, you know, you've been through it before, you've seen it, and trust me, we're not always right. But, you know, I think Jackie Robinson's ratio batting average was like 330. So, I mean,
you're still world class if you have a 330 batting average.
Exactly. And I've always get corrected on it now, but I mean, the phrase used to be that ball players that bat 500 get paid some pretty good money. So we don't have to be right all the time, but we have to be directionally correct.
Right. And people know that you're trying to do the right thing.
Right. Absolutely.
Next one you talked about was thinking globally and acting locally.
Yeah, I had a great colleague of mine that is actually a CPO for the city of Westminster in the UK, and he actually coined the phrase, we're going to be global. And it's a little bit awkward to say, but, you know, we think from a global perspective, but we act locally. And I think, especially as U.S.-based companies, we're somewhat arrogant in thinking that business is done the way we do it around the world. And, you know, I think, you know, you talk about, there's a lot of different things we could use as examples, but if you take a look at globally dealing with real estate and facilities, right? Companies in the U.S. will pick a U.S.-based company who partners with other players in different regions and areas, the names of which most of them don't even know. And then you talk to your friends, so you know you're going to get some more space in the UK, and they engage with the partner, and folks are scratching their head and say, these folks are not great players.
Right.
So it kills your credibility. So from my perspective, it's a matter of looking at the best-in-class players wherever you are and then finding a network in which you can knit those together. The simplest way to do it, obviously, is just select one player that deals with it on a global basis. But I don't think that's going to give you the best credibility and the best outcomes.
No, and actually, speaking as someone who worked in the UK for US companies, I can completely empathize with that point. That's something that we would always be challenged with, and when that would occur, we would then just go and do our own thing, and it really it didn't help the credibility of what the US team, the global team, were trying to implement. Because you go and try and do your own thing.
You're right. I mean, the other thing that Anthony taught me, and we talked a lot about this because it was helpful for me to understand the dynamic when hiring people outside of the U.S. to work with a U.S.-based company. And Anthony's words, and I'll never forget it, is, Jack, it's an acquired taste, right? Because you have to understand what the problem is that I think folks overseas, non-U.S. based, understand that more than the Americans understand it. And we've got to get better at doing that, given the globalization and everything that's going on.
Yeah, culture is huge. Actually, the way that you operate in different cultures, it's not just about pushing a message from the center and expecting that everybody will act in the same way, because even what is procurement means different things to different people depending on where they are in the world.
Absolutely.
Next one was seek first to understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to come into a conversation and just sort of assume you know where it's going to go. And, one of the skills that I think has begun to be lost is listening. You hear what someone wants to do, get the entire concept, because the concept sometimes changes as they articulate it.
Right.
And listen to the entire thing and work to find ways of commonality or points of commonality that focus more on the sameness versus the differences. And if you find that a good chunk of it's the same, you've got a couple of things to tweak. But, ask and have a conversation as to why and how and understand the rationale.
Right.
Many times I've found that, I'm coming into a conversation or discussion with certain predetermined notions, yet as you go through the discussion, you find there's some merit in what someone else is thinking or suggesting. So deal with that. And, people support what they help create. So if you're able to lay out some of those concepts and they're able to buy into them, then you can articulate on the strategy, or you can pivot on the strategy and deliver good value.
No, it's important that people do buy in, if they buy into something, when they have an active role in actually creating it rather than you operating in a silo.
Absolutely.
Next one was prepare and share.
Yeah, one of the challenges that I found in the procurement business is people don't do their research. And they don't go out and, it goes back to understanding a little bit, but they don't go out and do the research. And, a great example is this conversation where you went out and you did some research and you come out with some things. And what did you wind up doing? Pivoting from what we were originally going to talk about to something else. And there's goodness in that. So I think from a procurement perspective, there's a lot. And if you look at the whole RFP process, which is a rather arrogant way to do things, is that we want to buy something. We don't know exactly what it is, who we want to buy it from, what the marketplace is out there, but let us give you the list of 175 things that we think that you should be able to do.
That have nothing to do with what you actually do.
Absolutely. And there are certain factoids that people that I've worked with know that are just things that I just chew on, and it's things like, and by the way, when you submit your proposal, send along your financials. Well, there's nobody on the team that can understand the financials. There's nobody that's going to read them. And by the way, why are you asking a supplier to respond to an RFP if you haven't in fact looked at their financial viability? So all of that stuff should be done. It's almost respect for the suppliers. That work should all be done ahead of time. And do your homework and understand. And suppliers won't always like this, but the reality is you're taking them down a path of almost commoditization. So rather than deal with 16 players, do your homework up front, boil it down, and wind up with a panel of 3 or 4 players, any of which you would be relatively happy dealing with if, in fact, the value proposition in the end is the right value proposition.
Yeah, you already know that you're going to want, that there's a possibility for you to work with those companies and you'll be prepared to award them the business.
Absolutely.
I struggle with, is it because we're so overworked or is it because we're lazy with an RFP that we just kind of send it out and we use that as our intelligence tool and then try and farm these same 100 questions to get what we need versus doing the upfront work?
Well, it's a great question, but if people are overworked, why are they creating more work and looking at a larger number of RFPs? I mean, I just did it for our homeowners association, so I've been out of this for a while, but we have a small community, 28 homes. We're all volunteers and we got tired of doing it all ourselves. And so we proposed that we would find a management firm. And, there were a couple that came to mind. But I did a little bit of homework, came up with 7 of them. First thing they all want to do is send me a proposal. Didn't say no, but you know what? They sent me, well, what did I find? I found that out of the 6 that sent me proposals, 2 of them were like double the price of everybody else. So we parked them. One of them didn't have licenses, so we took them out of the process. And, I went through the RFP or their proposals and basically said, hey, there's some stuff in here that we didn't think of. And we took the information and we put it into our spec sheet, sent them out a spec sheet and it says, take a look at this. I've already gotten your proposal, but tell me that everything we've got in here is going to be covered, or if it's an up and extra, what it's going to cost us. They all came back and it was a done deal. Now, I could have sent it out to everybody, but I already knew that 3 of them weren't going to be qualified. What's the point?
And you said about commoditizing it. When you're sending it out to 10, 20, 30 people, I've even spoken to somebody who's sent it to 100 people, then ultimately you're just trying to commoditize it, and that might not be what you need or what you're buying. You're actually wanting people to provide solutions to a challenge you have, not to provide something that you may think looks good on an Excel sheet and spits out the right number at the end of it.
Absolutely. And I mean, the other challenge with this, and I had a large deal that we did for a large financial services company years ago, and we were actually not suggesting the lowest price. And I remember being challenged by the president of the group. Sat there. I was with my team, and he looked at me and he said, "Jack, I can't believe that you are not presenting me with the lowest cost alternative." Yeah. And I said, "Lowest cost isn't best value. Right. I can tell you that they will not be able to deliver on this long term. And we're looking at getting into a 5-year deal. And the reality is this deal that we're recommending is a deal that will live on and they'll be able to deliver on." And that's what we ultimately did. My team, there was like a gasp in the room when the question was asked. But the reality is there's a good answer. And it's where you have to have the courage, again, to stand up and do what you believe is the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not just necessarily something that aligns with what your objective is, because that just helps you chalk off a few more $100,000 or $1 million towards some cost avoidance target that never even means anything.
Exactly.
You talked about value, and that was the final point that you made, was adding value to others.
Well, it's like the example that I just gave. It's not always price. It's not always cost. I mean, cost is a factor. Price usually isn't, but it's the overall cost. And it's the whole value proposition. Mm-hmm. How do you weave innovation into it? How do you weave leadership into it? I mean, you look at emerging technologies today, and when we made our first bet on e-procurement, technology, which was about 20 years ago. Yeah. They were big, they were expensive, they were challenging. We saw all of that. We sat around and said there's got to be a better way. And of course today, we're sitting at the Coupa event, and there's a better way to do this stuff. It's it's cloud-based, it's easy to implement, it's all those other things. But we looked at all of that and we realized kind of what's the value proposition in this. And it was also looking at the leadership team. And who we thought was going to take the business to the next level, because everything we wanted wasn't there. Yeah. But we realized that we were early adopters and it was going to take some time to get there. And personally, I believe that because of our positioning with this particular supplier, and they wanted our input, we would have the ability to be able to influence some of what they were going to be doing as far as future functionality. So that's all in the value proposition and things that you need to look at.
So how do you go about educating, or how have you been had success in educating leaders about what value may look like when it's different from what their preconceived notion of what you should be achieving is?
Well, some of it's kind of creating almost disciples in some of this stuff, right? And over the years, I've had people that have sort of followed and come over to companies that I've worked at, and that's been a big plus. But people get the concepts. There are some people that are going to understand those concepts, and they're going to adapt to them, and they're going to understand what's going on. I think leadership, one of the traits of leadership is being relatively predictable. And when people understand where it is you want to take the business and where you want to go with it and how we execute on doing some of that, it's a very easy process because all they have to do is apply the steps and the decisioning against the strategy. And if it fits, it ain't rocket science, right? So you just kind of move forward and you do that. The other thing is to be supportive, because I was in a group one time, and it was a similar sort of question. And how can you sort of describe what you do with your team that kind of makes you different? And I've sort of lived to not totally regret this, but I'll tell the story. Is that I ask folks, they're not always the nicest thing to watch, but a bullfight, and you see a matador in the ring with the bull. And what happens when the matador gets in trouble? Usually a bunch of clowns come over the sideboards, run out, right? They distract the bull, and they allow the matador to get back up on their feet,
compose themselves
and start again. Well, guess what? I'm the clown in the bull ring.
Right.
So when my folks get in trouble or something happens and they're following the guidance and directions that we really want to follow, it's my responsibility to make sure we support them, back them up, and deal with what we have to do. And I've often said that, every project, every situation that you get into, there are things that work well and there are things that don't work well. And what separates the really good players from the ones that are mediocre is the ability to be able to recover. And you recover quickly, and you move on, you raise your hand, take your foul, and get it over with, and just keep going. And you've got to have leadership that's willing to support that and understand and basically take on that risk.
Do leadership typically do that?
No.
So is there a way that you can encourage them to, or is it really situational?
It comes back to courage again. I mean, are you willing to step out? And, what I said in the very beginning is the reason that I got into this business is that I realized if I could slightly differentiate myself from everybody else in the business, it could be a pretty interesting career. And it has been. And I think, I and the teams that I've been fortunate enough to work with, we have differentiated ourselves and done some good stuff.
I just wanted to touch on the relationship that CPO has with the CFO. And, that's often the most important relationship for a number of different reasons, often because we're reporting up through a CFO function. How can you foster a strong relationship with a CFO? Are cost savings everything to them, or is it just that we believe that cost savings are important to them, so that's what we give them? Or should we be looking at kind of managing that differently?
I think it's that we believe that that's what they want to hear. And I don't believe that there are many, if any, C-suite executives that wake up in the morning and say, boy, today I want to just save a lot of money.
Right.
That's not what their strategy is. That's not where they're going with their business. Is it important? Sure. Mm-hmm. But they expect it to work and they expect it to happen. And I think what folks in the procurement space really need to do is understand what those drivers are, because frankly, they're going to be different for each. I mean, one CFO that I worked for said, Jack, as long as I know you're involved in the deals, that's all I really care about. Mm-hmm. So, your DNA, your team's DNA is on that stuff. That's goodness, and I'm happy with it. We talk about savings, and this was the same CFO that actually challenged us one time. We worked on a big IT telecommunications deal. And we reported our results and everything else. And in the end, it was probably 6-8 months afterwards, he came to me and he said, you guys talked about saving all of that money, but at the end of the day, I don't see any difference in the P&L, and I actually see an increase in cost. Right. And I've been a big believer in measure and manage, and it's not just measuring dollars, which is what most people do. You've got to measure units, because if you're not measuring units, you don't have the ability to really go back and understand it. And we went back, and we should have been looking at this all along, but we took our eye off the ball. And it wound up that the call centers changed from having 800 numbers, from having direct dial in to using 800 numbers, which switched the cost to us.
Right.
And we were able to go back, do the work, give it to them, and said, our numbers are solid. The reason you didn't see this is because the business changed their operating model.
So is it also because we don't necessarily know how to tie non-financial value back into an ROI, or the kind of value that we create for our businesses? We don't necessarily know how to demonstrate that we've created that value, so we just always fall back on numbers because as procurement people, that's what we know best.
It's what we know best. It's what we've done all along. And the reality is, as I said earlier, the biggest plus that I can hear out of a business leader is that, Jack and his team did a great job. They helped us do the deal, and we make sure that they're involved in the stuff that we do because we've demonstrated value. People talk about mandates also. It's like you have a mandate to do the job. There are no mandates. No. I don't care what somebody says, because as soon as you tell somebody that they should do it, they will immediately try to find ways to go around the process. Yeah. The mandate gives you the opportunity to engage, but it's up to you to demonstrate the value. And if you can't demonstrate the value, you won't get invited back.
Right. No, that's really important. I had a final question as we're coming against time here, and that was that I'd read about your fundamental belief being that everything essentially can be done better and faster than it's been done today. And that I know you've been an early adopter of technology, and we talked about that a little bit in terms of the P2P space. So I was interested to know, given what you see today, if you were a CPO today, what technology would you take a chance on?
Clearly, it's cloud-based. It's built cloud from the ground up. It's a leadership team within the company that is committed to delivering value and looking at success. The reality is we've got a lot of rebaked technology out there. We've got ERP systems that, because the cloud's become the buzzword, everybody's scrambling behind the scenes. But if you look under the covers, it's ugly.
Same thing.
It's the same stuff. Same stuff, different day. And I think people have to get smart, and most of them are, and they've got to take a look at what's out there. But if you look, I'm obviously on the advisory board of Coupa. I don't lend my name or my engagement to firms that I don't have a firm belief in. Yeah. And when you look at what they're delivering in the marketplace today, it is different, and they're doing a great job. They're focused on their customers, and they're focused on value.
Well, Jack, thank you very much for your time today. I wanted to ask if listeners would like to learn a little bit more or to find some of your writing or engage a little further, is there a good way of them to find you?
Absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn, and it's John P. Jack Miles. look me up, send me a message, and happy to connect. And a lot of the postings that we've done, I actually publish some of those on LinkedIn.
Great. Well, I will link up to your contact details on the show notes of the page. The show notes are actually going to be at artofprocurement.com/DAO, which is actually TAO, artofprocurement.com/DAO. And I'll also link up to the post, which was the inspiration behind the questions that I had for you today. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Jack. To subscribe to our regular newsletter, the AOP Insider, and never miss an episode of the podcast, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe. And you can find our back catalogue from the past 5 years at artofprocurement.com.